For our Halloween month, we thought it would be interesting to draw a parallel between two movies that are very different but come from a pretty similar set of archetypes. The Victorian-era Penny Dreadful was a British version of the serial literature that would become popular as the dime store novels in early 20th century America. It was one of the earliest versions of mass-produced pop culture. Often sold at executions, these were sensationalist stories which came in weekly parts for a penny. One such Penny Dreadful series was The String of Pearls. The String of Pearls was the story of Sweeney Todd, a crazed barber on Fleet Street who cut his customers with a straight razor. That is, if they didn't die from falling through the revolving trapdoor under his barber chair and breaking their necks. At some point, this reversed, with Sweeney Todd first cutting them and then putting them through the revolving door. Honestly, so much easier. He gave the corpses to his neighbor, Mrs. Lovett, who baked them into meat pies. This serial ran from 1846 to 1847 originally. Other Penny Dreadful characters included Spring-Heeled Jack, a demon-like creature who terrorized the streets of London, grabbing women and clawing them up. This urban legend caused a mass panic, first in the 1830s and 1840s, as people in London and then northern England swore they saw Spring-Heeled Jack. These urban legends, ghost stories, and sensationalist literature were common in a quickly industrializing and extremely unequal Victorian society. Spring-Heeled Jack supposedly returned in 1870 and 1888, which happened to be the same year another Jack began terrorizing the streets of London.
What did he promise you? Money? Lots of money? For you to become a doctor, was it? Well, he's laughing at you. Because now you're gonna hang.
Jack the Ripper quickly became an international celebrity after 5 murders, the canonical 5, occurred in London's Whitechapel district in 1888. Starting in August, women, most of whom were sex workers, began being found in Whitechapel disemboweled, brutally cut into pieces, and left for police to find. Police flooded the streets of Whitechapel in London's East End. The story went international when a letter was found signed Jack the Ripper, which said, among other things, "I'm down on whores, and I shan't quit ripping them until I get buckled." This and a second letter, which both began Dear Boss, led to a flood of letters, many of which were probably faked by newspapermen trying to get in on the story. And that's kind of the point of a lot of this. The line between real and fake gets blurred in a rush to try to bolster these urban legends.
And it goes by the name of London.
2 of the movies we are exploring this month come directly out of this period of sensationalist 19th century Britain. Starting tonight with Tim Burton's Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street, and continuing on October 17th with Alfred Hitchcock's Frenzy, a modern take on the Jack the Ripper murders. The Jack the Ripper idea appears throughout Hitchcock's work, starting with his feature film The Lodger in 1927, and arguably continuing with Psycho in 1960. Frenzy and Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street, both grab up these 19th century archetypes that'll be fun to explore in spooky October. Sweeney Todd, of course, is a wholly fictional character created for the Penny Dreadfuls. However, the story did come from older urban legends, as Charles Dickens referenced those preparers of cannibalistic pastry in Martin Chuzzlewit. Within a year of the serialization, George Dibdin Pitt had created the play The String of Pearls, or The Fiend of Fleet Street, for the Britannia Theatre. Pitt added a catchphrase, "I'll polish 'em off." Then Edward Lloyd, the original publisher of the People's Periodical that published the first serialization, published a longer 92-episode serialization from 1847 to 1848. So the original serialization, the play, and then the longer version all came within 2 years. That's how popular Sweeney Todd had become. The book was plagiarized and adapted in America as Sweeney Todd or the Ruffian Barber, and then it was once again adapted in 1865 and 1875 as it was turned into a play and then a book of the play. In 1936, George King adapted the George Dibdin Pitt play into Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street, a movie starring British horror star Todd Slaughter.
Oh, what a beautiful knife. That's the knife that Mrs. Lovett used in her pie shop before I polished her off. And this is the pistol with which I shot Maria Martin.
In 1973, the British playwright Christopher Bond turned Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street, into a modern play. Bond decided to give Sweeney Todd a more sympathetic backstory, naming him Benjamin Barker, a barber who was thrown into an Australian penal colony for 15 years on trumped-up charges by Judge Turpin, who raped his wife and stole his daughter. He returns to Fleet Street as Sweeney Todd, swearing to get revenge first on Turpin and then on humanity itself. This is when Stephen Sondheim, Harold Prince, and Arthur Lawrence, whose name you might remember from our Rope episode last month, decided to adapt Bond's play into a musical.
Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street, the new Stephen Sondheim Harold Prince musical thriller starring Angela Lansbury and Glenn Carreyrou.
Sondheim was a big fan of Christopher Bond's play and believed that the music would heighten the drama.
Charity towards the world, my pet. We'll take the customers that we can get.
It opened starring Glenn Carreyrou and Angela Lansbury in 1979 on Broadway, and then London's West End in 1980. British audiences, who I'm sure had seen every iteration of Sweeney Todd, were largely unenthusiastic, but American audiences loved it.
Tim Burton had actually come to me about 20 years ago. He was a big fan of the piece. He'd seen it in London. It was not a success in London the first go-round. It has been since, but the very first time it was done in London, they didn't like it.
Sondheim's play was also shaped by Angela Lansbury, who only agreed to star in it if Mrs. Lovett could get a much bigger music hall role.
I thought, well, it's certainly something to consider, and they're very enthusiastic, these two, and obviously they're brilliant. They must have something up their sleeve for this show. So, but on the other hand, you know, the old star said, hey, wait a minute, this is called Sweeney Todd. How does Mrs. Lovett fit in, you know? It's not called Nellie Lovett, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street, it's Sweeney Todd. So I thought, I hope, you know, is this a good part?
Tim Burton and Helena Bonham Carter were both huge fans of the musical, with Tim Burton claiming to have seen the musical 13 times between 1979 and 1980. And so, in 2007, Tim Burton adapted Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street, starring who else but Johnny Depp and Helena Bonham Carter as Sweeney Todd and Mrs. Lovett.
First got together with Tim, he was talking about it and saying that he'd been marinating this idea of the musical. And it was one of our talking points. We got something in common. We both love Sweeney Todd, you know. And that's about it, though.
It was Tim Burton's first live-action musical, and Johnny Depp and Helena Bonham Carter, first time doing a musical on screen. The adaptation, I think, is pretty straightforward. It's not Tim Burton's most creative work, but it's a good adaptation nonetheless, and Tim Burton makes it stylistic and gory while keeping the contained feeling of the stage play. The stage play famously has a revolving and very mobile set, with the barber chair having to act as a chute, and filming an adaptation solved many logistical problems, while Tim Burton made sure to keep the very contained stage play feeling.
The history of the world, my love.